You are listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm in the studio with Dr. Patrick Lopez Aguado, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Santa Clara University. He earned his PhD in Sociology from UC Santa Barbara in 2013. His research interests include race and incarceration, juvenile justice, youth and street cultures, and urban ethnography. And he teaches courses on the principles of sociology, sociology of the criminal justice system, gender and justice, and sociology of deviance. He's the author of Stick Together and Come Back Home, Racial Sorting and the Spillover of Carceral Identity, published by UC Press in 2018. I've invited Patrick back on the show to talk about some of the changes to the criminal justice system here in California and about some of his upcoming research. Welcome back, Patrick, to Voces Críticas.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back.
So a lot of changes are happening in California, and I want us to talk a little bit about some of the most recent ones in the last few months. One being the SB 1391, which was signed by California Governor Jerry Brown, which ensures that 14 and 15-year-olds accused of crimes will be tried in the juvenile justice system rather than prosecuted as adults. And he passed this on October 1st, 2018. I wondered what your thoughts are on this legal change and the impact you think it would have on the research that you do in Fresno.
I think it could be a change that would be particularly impactful in the Central Valley, and especially among many of the youth that I worked with and talk about in the book. And we know this because it's Black and Latino youth who are far more likely to be charged as adults, right, even as teenagers. And geographically as well, many of the counties in the Central Valley that are far more likely or more frequently charge juveniles as adults, as opposed to many of the coastal counties or Bay Area, Los Angeles. You know, it's inland in the state where this can be something most impactful. And I think it's a positive step, right? I think it's a step in the right direction because so much of what I was finding in my work was that it's through many of these juvenile justice systems, of these carceral institutions, where you see this kind of institutionalization of not only identities that then wind up criminalizing or labeling young people, and particularly among Latinos as norteños, as sureños, as Fresno Bulldogs, but that so much of this came in this sort of broad anticipation of the possibility of incarceration. So it was among youth who were in communities where they saw so many people around them being sent to prison. And as they became increasingly entrenched in a juvenile justice system that they had difficulty escaping, that kind of made real or manifest these, not only these identities, but also the conflicts, the feuds between them. So I think this is a positive thing for the youth in a number of ways. So those who are, will be saved from being charged as adults. In terms of avoiding some of those longer sentences that oftentimes stem from going through the adult system, but also in a way where it can perhaps make their time in the juvenile system more productive. Because previously, if, say, a 15-year-old was charged as an adult, they would get this longer sentence, but they wouldn't be transferred into an adult facility until they hit 18. So for those, 2-3 years while you're sitting in juvenile detention, you know that you're going into this adult prison. And so I think it can be easy to understand why then youth in that situation would have little investment in, say, some of the education, some of the programming that's available at that level. So if youth know that they're staying in the juvie, they don't necessarily have to anticipate that, this kind of certainty that they will go into the adult system, right? They can have that kind of stability where they can focus more on perhaps some of the resources that are being made available to them at the juvenile level.
I mean, as I was preparing this interview with you, I thought to myself, 14 and 15-year-olds, like that is where we were as a state. And then, of course, I think about what about the 16 and 17-year-olds? But I was sort of stunned on some level that this was really just a few months ago. This has been a long-standing practice then in the state of California to incarcerate young people at 14, 15, prosecute them through the adult system. And so at this point, if they're prosecuted through the adult system, they could possibly be getting life sentences. They are adults at that point.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that becomes so much of the argument for doing this, or at least previously this was, where you would see these horrible stories of a young child, 13, 14-year-old who, say, murdered a classmate. And the argument that, well, how can we let a murderer only be incarcerated for, 6-7 years or, however. And so that became much of the argument for saying, like, no, we need more serious, longer term sentences. They deserve life the same as someone in their 20s killed someone deserves life. But like so many of these things, that the extreme is rarely the typical case, right? So most youth who are charged as adults aren't being charged on homicide. It's for burglary, it's robbery, it's perhaps a weapons charge, things like that. And so they're not necessarily going to stay in prison for life, but they are going to be incarcerated longer than they would in the juvenile system. It winds up contributing more to the overpopulation of the state's prison system, but also puts them into an adult system, even if you wait till they're 18 to transfer them, which even that wasn't always the case. But even at 18, they're still some of the most vulnerable individuals, right, in that prison, right? They're more likely to be assaulted. They're more likely to be sexually assaulted. And it winds up, creating an entirely new set of problems for them, not only in terms of their physical safety, but also in terms of recidivism and trying to stay out of that system.
And I'm even thinking at 14, if you are being, prosecuted as an adult and get an adult sentence, what job prospects lie ahead for you? What kind of other opportunities are now voting, et cetera? You're no longer able to engage in those acts because you have now a record. I mean, one of the things about the juvenile justice system, as I understand it, that record doesn't necessarily stay with you for the rest of your life. But in this case, it would seem like for these teenagers, that was their fate.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are charged an adult, that does become a permanent status. And so Michelle Alexander talks about this. She discusses this as the new Jim Crow because she talks about it in terms of creating a caste, this unavoidable status that once you've been convicted, you're never not an ex-con, for example. And that becomes something that follows you, right, as you're applying for jobs, as you're applying for housing. Number of apartments, as you're applying, it asks, does anyone in your family have a criminal record? And that can be legal reason to not rent you an apartment. It doesn't necessarily matter how long ago that was. So yeah, these become a series of consequences that young people then face where if they remain in the juvenile system, they don't necessarily have that same kind of permanent record, but they also are part of a system that has a greater emphasis on, say, education and trying to provide more services or programming for them.
So let's talk a little bit about the juvenile justice system, because recently California Governor Gavin Newsom came out with a proposal to move the California juvenile justice system out of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to a new department under the Health and Human Services Agency. And this move really intrigued me, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, is this the kind of move we should be doing and thinking about the decriminalization of even the juvenile justice system? Is this at least giving new opportunities for young people that maybe were denied to them before?
Yeah, I certainly think it's a step in the right direction. Right now, I want to know more about how it's actually going to be implemented, and it seems like details are a little scarce at this point.
Scarce details is always how these proposals come forward.
Right, exactly. So, that'll be, when we can have a much more thorough and critical kind of evaluation of what this move entails. On its face, I do think it's a step in the right direction. And I was on campus today and kind of talking about some of this history of the state's juvenile justice system, formerly California Youth Authority, now I believe the Division of Juvenile Justice, that had up to this point been under the authority of the state's Department of Corrections, and even that changed to Corrections and Rehabilitation. So there's this kind of broader movement away from pure criminalization. Like I said, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I think it's an attempt to undo much of the work of the kind of tough on crime movements of the 80s and 90s, right, that worked on enhancing sentences, that worked on putting people away for longer terms, and particularly cracking down on juvenile crime. You had this kind of narrative of the super predator that was kind of gaining traction in the moment and creating an idea that young people were dangerous in ways that they hadn't been in previous generations. And that this was the reason, for example, trying them as adults, as 14 and 15-year-olds. So the system now is a lot smaller than it was, right? In the 90s, you had about 10,000 in YA across, maybe like 10 or 12 facilities, something like that. Now it's like 500-600. And the state is much more reluctant to accept juveniles into state custody. They're pushing counties to keep offenders at the county level, which is good for a lot of reasons. Keeping them in county jurisdiction means that they tend to stay local. So even if they're in juvenile hall for even extended periods, at least they are near their hometowns. So your families can still come visit you in a way that may be much more difficult, if not impossible, if you're in a state facility that's several hours away. The small number that the state is still taking into custody, I think with that smaller number, that does make a lot more things possible in terms of education, in terms of programming. So you're not crowding too many people into a classroom. You can teach a little more specifically to specific, say, grade levels or reading levels or what have you. You can give a little bit more attention to them as individuals, as students. I think perhaps make some of that counseling, some of that therapy, some of those lessons a little bit more productive. But again, this is something we're all going to have to see how it actually materializes as the shift happens.
So what else do you think needs to happen in the criminal justice system? We have now this proposal to move into the Health and Human Services Agency. What else would you like to see happen in the juvenile justice system?
I think within the juvenile system, one of the things I like about this shift to Health and Human Services is finding ways of disrupting this kind of anticipation of imprisonment. So even something as simple as this kind of bureaucratic shift can kind of change how things actually happen, potentially makes new kinds of programming available or possible, probably makes new sources of funding available, right, depending on the kinds of grants they're applying for or what have you. The more that you can distance any kind of facility or institution working with or ideally serving young people, right, the more you can distance that from the prison system, the better. The problems that I kind of found so much in the book and in the research that I was doing was youth essentially learning to see incarceration not necessarily as inevitable, but as something that was so common, so frequent that they felt like they had to be kind of ready in the event that this happened. And so the more you can kind of diminish that sense of anticipating this as a common trajectory for folks from your neighborhood, I think all the better.
If we think about these carceral institutions, and based on your research and expertise here, in what ways do these carceral institutions in California, whether it be the juvenile justice system or the adult system, how do they actually produce or reproduce the violence and criminality that they're actually supposed to respond to, whether it's through so-called rehabilitation efforts or just the ways in which these institutions themselves are inherently violent through the production of a criminality identity?
So I think so much of this occurs through much of the preoccupation with worrying about gang activity and gang violence both among young people in the juvenile system and even adults in the prison system. And this isn't to say that gangs don't exist or that gangs don't fight, of course, but much of how these institutions are runs very much around the presumption of gang activity or gang involvement. So you have then entire facilities that come to be segregated based on your race, based on where you're from, under the possibility that, we don't know that you're a gang member, but you might be, or you might be supporting someone who is, and so we're going to keep you away from people who might be supporting this other side. And so it's through that separation where whichever category you get kind of lumped into, the fact that those divisions are reinforced on a day-to-day basis makes that a real identity for you, both in terms of your own kind of self-perception where you see like, these are the people around me, these are the people who I know and, to some extent can trust, or that I'm at least, kind of socializing or working with on a day-to-day basis. But I know I don't trust people on the other side of the yard. And so that makes the identities meaningful. It makes the threat that you see in that other side real. So you kind of anticipate them as a risk to your safety. You learn to avoid them if you can. But, many of the parolees I would talk to, when they would talk about the sense of, being cornered, where if they were, say, mislabeled and put into a housing unit that, they weren't with other, say, Northerners or other Bulldogs, the first thing they did was lash out at someone, right? Because they knew that would get them locked down, that would get them isolated, and then they would later be segregated the way that they wanted. So it teaches folks to learn to use violence strategically in that way in order to feel safe. And of course, it works to kind of reinforce the labels that are put on them, right? So, oh, look, they are gang involved. They are a Bulldog or they are a Norteño. And this is why we need to isolate them. And this is why we need to keep separating them.
You're listening to Dr. Patrick Lopez Aguado, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Santa Clara University and the author of Stick Together and Come Back Home, Racial Sorting and the Spillover of Carceral Identity, published by the University of California Press in 2018. Let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a teacher of criminology. and the different courses that you teach there at Santa Clara around the criminal justice system. As a teacher and scholar teacher in this area, what do you want your students to take away and understand about the criminal justice system?
Some of the things I try to emphasize are pushing them to think about crime and criminal justice sort of beyond a fairly typical narrative where, I have a lot of students who come in and, I'll ask them, why are you interested in this? And they'll say, well, I watch a lot of Law and Order, or, I'm always interested in, shows like Gangland, or I don't know if Gangland's even on anymore, but.
Yeah, I've never heard that show, Patrick. So.
They had it on the History Channel for a minute, I think. Getting interested in these kind of either sensationalized cases or in some of the ways that crime and threats of criminal activity are oftentimes sort of framed and packaged and marketed. And so they come in sort of knowing that that's not really true, right? It's a Hollywood depiction, but they're also not necessarily sure how to kind of critically assess the things that they see or read about the justice system. So I try to focus, say things like the origins of the justice system, right? How this becomes something that works to primarily police being founded out of this history of crowd control and how that was essentially used to put down labor movements. So if we think about how police have historically been used to enforce a particular economic and racial order, and that's not necessarily to say that this is the motivation of officers, right, signing up on police forces now, but we do have to think of it as an institution, and you can't necessarily so easily separate it from that history. So what are ways that we can think about how does this still function? And maybe in ways that we're blind to, right? Maybe in ways that we don't really think about. Getting them to think something like gangs, right? Think more abstractly about, this term that we kind of throw around and we act as if it's kind of an objective thing. But, what is the history of that term? Who was it applied to? Who was it not applied to? And what is the purpose or the function of using that term? So getting them to kind of step back and to think about things in this way.
Yeah, that's hard work, but I think it's so important because if we want to actually change this larger system and the discourse around it, this is where we need to think about the role of the institution. So tell us what's up next for you in terms of your research.
So in terms of the research, I'm kind of enjoying the book being out now. It's definitely a load off, weight off the shoulders. I'm working on a few kind of more theoretical pieces coming out of it. So one that I'm trying to wrap up now is how can we think about broad identities? And in this paper, it's thinking about blood and crip identities. So one of the things that I found in the field, but I didn't really get to incorporate into the book, was in Fresno, they would have, local street cliques or gangs where they would have both blood and crip members, for example. And so it wasn't necessarily something that was determined by the group as a whole. It was kind of individually decided, you be what you want to be. And so thinking about how this seems so different from how we kind of typically talk about, Bloods and Crips as these sort of like massive organizations that are opposed to each other, recognizing some of the differences in terms of how youth actually use them and really kind of fluid and inconsistent ways. What does that mean about, what they think about these identities, right? What do they actually mean to them? So that's one piece. And another one is looking at this notion of what are known as degradation ceremonies or rituals. So examples being like the arrest and the perp walk, or being sort of the moment where you are found guilty. You have this sort of public display where you are given a kind of degraded status. And so thinking about how this is something implemented in the justice system, but also throughout, in the day-to-day life of, say, being in county jail. What are different ways that your status is regularly degraded or dehumanized? How do people work around that, but how do people also resist that?
Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming on the show. We're actually out of time. It was great to have you back, and you're always welcome back onto Voces Críticas.
Thank you so much.